There's a new development to tell you about in the $250 million civil trial against ex-President Donald Trump and his company and his family. Today, Judge Engoron ruled that the former president's daughter, Ivanka, does have to testify in this case. Ivanka's lawyers had challenged the subpoena issued by the New York Attorney General on the basis that an appeals court this summer ruled Ivanka should not be a defendant due to the statute of limitations. But Judge Engoron sided with New York Attorney General Letitia James, who had said in a court filing this, quote, while no longer a defendant in this action, she indisputably has personal knowledge of facts relevant to the claims against the remaining individuals and entity defendants. But even beyond that, Ms. Trump remains financially and professionally intertwined with the Trump Organization and other defendants and can be called as a person still under their control.
All right, so this just got real, like really real. Ivanka Trump has been subpoenaed by prosecutors, and we're not just talking about a routine legal request here. We're talking about Special Counsel Jack Smith and New York prosecutors coming at her with evidence they say she can no longer deny or avoid under oath. This is Ivanka Trump, who's been trying to distance herself from her father's legal problems, who's been trying to maintain this image of being above the fray, suddenly being dragged into the center of multiple investigations, with prosecutors saying they've got her dead to rights on things she previously denied. And the evidence they're talking about: internal emails, text messages, financial documents, recorded statements, a paper trail that legal experts say directly contradicts what Ivanka and her legal team have been claiming for months. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Punk Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president's end?
The conversation was pretty heated. It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Many of President Trump's White House staff also recognized that the evidence did not support the claims President Trump was making.
How did that affect your perspective about the election when Attorney General Barr made that statement?
It affected my perspective. I respect Attorney General Barr. So I accepted what he was saying.
Which, by default, means I did not believe what my father was saying. Now it looks like she'll be forced to testify against her father once again.
So here's the situation. Ivanka is facing subpoenas from multiple sources. Special Counsel Jack Smith wants her testimony about January 6th and Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. New York prosecutors want her testimony about the Trump Organization fraud case. And both of them are saying they've got new evidence that makes her testimony absolutely critical. We're talking about communications that show she was directly involved in key decisions, in financial dealings, in meetings where illegal activity may have been discussed or planned. This isn't Ivanka being called as a peripheral witness who might have overheard something. This is prosecutors saying she was in the room where it happened, she knew what was going on, and they can prove it. And here's what makes this so dramatic. Ivanka has been trying really hard to stay out of this mess. After Trump left office, she and Jared basically disappeared from public life. They moved to Florida. They've been keeping a low profile. Ivanka has distanced herself from Trump's political activities. She didn't campaign for him. She's been trying to rebuild her business reputation and her brand separate from all the legal chaos surrounding her father. And now prosecutors are saying, nope, you don't get to just walk away from this. You were part of the Trump Organization. You were a senior White House advisor. You were involved in key decisions. And we have evidence that proves it. The timing here is also crucial. These subpoenas are coming as multiple investigations are heating up. The January 6th investigation is moving toward potential criminal charges. The New York fraud case has already resulted in massive judgments against Trump and the Trump Organization. The New York fraud case has already resulted in massive judgments against Trump and the Trump Organization. And prosecutors in both cases are saying that Ivanka's testimony could be the missing piece that ties everything together. She was uniquely positioned. She was both a Trump Organization executive and a White House advisor. She had access to her father's thinking and planning in ways that almost nobody else did. She was in meetings that other witnesses can corroborate. And prosecutors are betting that under oath, facing potential perjury charges if she lies, she'll have to tell the truth about what really happened. Legal experts who've been following these cases are saying this is a huge development. One analyst put it this way: Ivanka cannot easily deny what's now on record. There's a paper trail, there's audio, there are multiple witnesses ready to testify. If she gets on the stand and tries to claim she didn't know about certain things or wasn't involved in certain decisions, prosecutors can pull out emails with her name on them. They can play recordings of meetings she attended. They can bring in other witnesses who'll say, no, actually, she was very much involved in this. That puts Ivanka in an incredibly difficult position because her options are basically tell the truth and potentially implicate her father and herself, or lie under oath and face perjury charges. And the specific evidence prosecutors are talking about is damning. Internal emails about asset valuations, where Ivanka was involved in discussions about how to value Trump Organization properties for different purposes. Text messages about loan negotiations, where inflated values were presented to banks. Financial documents with Ivanka's signature or approval on them. Communications about planning meetings in the lead up to January 6th. Recorded statements where Ivanka said things that directly contradict what she and her lawyers later claimed. This isn't circumstantial evidence. This isn't speculation. Prosecutors are saying they have documents and recordings that prove Ivanka was directly involved in activities that are now the subject of fraud investigations and criminal probes. The House investigation previously questioned Ivanka and Jared about January 6th and their roles in the White House, but now the Justice Department and state prosecutors are coming back with more pointed questions and more specific evidence. They're asking about inconsistencies in previous sworn testimony. They're confronting Ivanka with documents that seem to show she knew more than she previously admitted. And they're making clear that this isn't optional. You can't just decline to testify because it's inconvenient or because it might hurt your family. When you get subpoenaed by a grand jury or ordered by a court to testify, you show up and you answer questions under oath. And think about what this means for the Trump family's legal strategy. For years, the approach has been to deny everything, to claim ignorance, to say that any problems were the fault of accountants or lawyers or low-level employees. But if prosecutors can get Ivanka on the stand and force her to admit that she knew about inflated valuations, that she was in meetings where illegal plans were discussed, that she approved documents that contained false information, that strategy falls apart. Because Ivanka was a Trump Organization executive. She was a White House senior advisor. She can't claim she was just a minor player who didn't know what was really going on. Her position and her involvement make her a key witness, and prosecutors are betting that the evidence they have will force her to tell the truth. So this is a massive development. Ivanka Trump, who's been trying to stay out of her father's legal troubles, is being dragged into the center of multiple investigations, with prosecutors saying they have evidence she can't deny anymore. And what she says under oath could potentially bring down not just Trump, but potentially expose Ivanka herself to legal jeopardy. Okay, so let's dig into the specifics of what prosecutors are going after and why Ivanka's testimony is so critical to these cases. Starting with the New York fraud investigation, because that's where some of the most concrete evidence apparently exists. The New York Attorney General has been investigating whether the Trump Organization systematically inflated the values of its properties and assets to get better loan terms from banks and better insurance rates, while simultaneously deflating those same asset values to pay lower taxes. This is textbook fraud if it's proven, and Ivanka was an executive vice president of the Trump Organization during the time period when much of this allegedly happened. So prosecutors are looking at specific transactions and specific documents where asset values were reported, and Ivanka's name and signature appear on a lot of these documents. She was involved in negotiations with banks. She was involved in loan applications. She was involved in insurance filings. And the evidence prosecutors say they have shows that she knew the valuations being used were inflated. How do they know she knew? Because they have internal emails where Trump Organization executives, including Ivanka, discussed the actual values versus the values they were reporting. They have communications where concerns were raised about whether certain valuations were defensible. They have documents showing that Ivanka approved or signed off on filings that used numbers that she had to know were inflated based on other information available to her. This is why prosecutors are so confident about being able to challenge her testimony. If Ivanka gets on the stand and says something like, "I relied on the accountants and I trusted that the valuations were accurate," prosecutors can show emails where she was personally involved in deciding what numbers to use. If she says she wasn't aware of discrepancies between tax valuations and loan valuations, they can show communications where those exact discrepancies were discussed and she was part of the conversation. The paper trail apparently makes it very difficult for Ivanka to claim ignorance or lack of involvement without committing perjury. And this matters because Ivanka is potentially more credible as a witness than some other Trump Organization employees. She's Trump's daughter. She was a White House advisor. She has an image as a successful businesswoman in her own right. If prosecutors can get her to admit under oath that the Trump organization engaged in fraud, that's more powerful than getting some random accountant or low-level employee to say it. Juries and judges give more weight to testimony from people who were actually in positions of authority and making decisions. Ivanka was absolutely in a position of authority at the Trump organization. Now let's talk about the January 6th investigation and Special Counsel Jack Smith's interest in Ivanka's testimony. This is about a completely different set of issues, but it's equally serious. Jack Smith is investigating Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election results, including the events of January 6th, and Ivanka was in the White House during this entire period. She was one of Trump's closest advisors. She was in meetings where post-election strategy was discussed. She has direct knowledge of what Trump knew, what he was being told, and what decisions he was making. The House January 6th committee already questioned Ivanka, and their report included some of her testimony. But now the Justice Department is following up with more detailed questions, and apparently with additional evidence that wasn't available during the House investigation. There are reports that investigators have obtained text messages and communications showing Ivanka was aware of concerns about Trump's behavior on January 6th. There's evidence that she tried to convince him to call off the rioters. There's testimony from other witnesses about conversations Ivanka had or meetings she attended where the legality of various schemes to overturn the election was discussed. So what prosecutors want to know is what exactly did Ivanka know about plans to pressure Mike Pence to reject electoral votes? What did she know about the fake elector scheme? What did she know about efforts to pressure state officials to change vote counts? What conversations did she have with her father about these things? And critically, what did Trump know about whether his claims of election fraud were actually true? Because if Ivanka can testify that Trump was told by multiple people that the election wasn't stolen, but he kept claiming it was anyway, that goes directly to Trump's intent and state of mind, which is crucial for any potential criminal charges. And here's where the inconsistencies in previous testimony become really important. Ivanka and Jared Kushner were both questioned by the House January 6th committee. They gave testimony that was generally protective of Trump, claiming that they weren't aware of certain things or couldn't remember specific conversations. But now prosecutors are coming back and saying, we have evidence that contradicts what you previously said. We have text messages you sent. We have testimony from other people who were in meetings with you. We have documents you received. And all of this evidence suggests you knew more than you claimed to know. When prosecutors confront witnesses with this kind of contradiction, it puts enormous pressure on them because now the witness has to either admit they lied in their previous testimony or they have to come up with some explanation for why the documentary evidence doesn't mean what it seems to mean. And if they can't come up with a credible explanation, they're essentially admitting they lied before, which could subject them to perjury charges for the previous false testimony. This is why legal experts are saying Ivanka is in a really tough spot. She can't just refuse to testify. You can't ignore a grand jury subpoena or a court order without being held in contempt. She can't plead the Fifth Amendment in the civil fraud case because that creates an adverse inference against her in civil court. And if she testifies, she has to tell the truth or risk perjury charges. The evidence prosecutors have apparently makes it very difficult for her to continue claiming ignorance or lack of involvement without contradicting documented facts. There's also the question of spousal privilege and whether Ivanka can refuse to testify about things Jared told her or vice versa. But spousal privilege is pretty limited. It doesn't apply to communications made in the presence of third parties. It doesn't apply to communications made in furtherance of a crime or fraud. And it doesn't protect documents or emails, only confidential communications between spouses. So while Ivanka and Jared's lawyers might try to invoke spousal privilege for some things, it's not going to protect most of what prosecutors want to ask about. The political implications of all this are enormous. Ivanka has been the one Trump family member who seemed to have successfully moved on from Trump's political controversies. She didn't get involved in Trump's recent political activities. She's been trying to rehabilitate her image and her business brand, but now she's being dragged back into the center of multiple investigations, and her testimony could potentially be devastating to her father's defense. That puts her in an impossible position personally and politically. Does she tell the truth and potentially help convict her father? Does she lie to protect him and risk her own criminal liability? Does she try to thread some needle where she's technically truthful but not volunteering anything that would hurt Trump? And there's the question of what all this means for Ivanka's own legal jeopardy. Because if she was involved in fraudulent financial dealings at the Trump organization, she doesn't just become a witness against her father, she potentially becomes a defendant herself. The New York fraud judgment that came down against Trump and his adult sons didn't include Ivanka, partly because her lawyers argue she hadn't been involved in the organization in recent years. But if prosecutors now have evidence that she was more deeply involved than previously believed, there could be additional charges or civil claims against her personally. Similarly, if Ivanka knew about illegal schemes to overturn the election and participated in any way, even just by being in meetings and not reporting what she heard, there are potential legal theories under which she could face charges. Conspiracy doesn't require that you personally commit the illegal act. It just requires that you knowingly participate in planning or furthering the conspiracy. If Ivanka was in meetings where fake elector schemes were discussed and she didn't report it or didn't try to stop it, prosecutors could potentially argue she was part of the conspiracy. All right, let's break this down into the key points because there's a lot happening here and it's important to understand what's actually at stake. Point number 1, the evidence prosecutors say they have. This isn't a fishing expedition where prosecutors are hoping Ivanka might know something useful. They're saying they have specific documents, emails, text messages, and recorded statements that contradict what Ivanka has previously claimed. They have her involved in discussions about asset valuations. They have her signature on documents with inflated values. They have communications showing she was in meetings where schemes to overturn the election were discussed. They have testimony from other witnesses that contradicts what Ivanka has said. This evidence apparently makes it impossible for her to continue claiming she didn't know about or wasn't involved in activities that are now under criminal and civil investigation. Point number 2, why Ivanka's testimony is so important to both the fraud case and the January 6th investigation. In the fraud case, Ivanka was a Trump Organization executive during the key time period when the alleged fraud was occurring. She was involved in loan negotiations and financial filings. She can testify about who knew what and who made decisions about how to value assets. Her testimony could directly implicate Trump and potentially other executives in knowing intentional fraud rather than honest mistakes or reliance on bad advice from accountants. In the January 6th investigation, Ivanka was one of Trump's closest advisors during the post-election period. She was in the White House on January 6th. She has direct knowledge of what Trump was thinking, what he was being told, and what decisions he was making. Her testimony could prove what Trump knew about the validity of election fraud claims and what his intent was in taking various actions. Point number 3, the legal trap Ivanka is in. She can't refuse to testify when subpoenaed by a grand jury or ordered by a court. She can't plead the Fifth in the civil fraud case without creating adverse inferences against her. If she testifies, she has to tell the truth or risk perjury charges, and prosecutors have evidence that makes it very difficult for her to maintain her previous claims of ignorance or minimal involvement without contradicting documented facts. So her options are basically tell the truth and potentially implicate her father and herself, or lie and face criminal charges for perjury, or try to claim she can't remember things, but that's hard to sustain when prosecutors can refresh her memory with specific documents and communications. The pressure on Ivanka is immense. She's built a life separate from Trump's political chaos. She's been trying to rebuild her business reputation and her brand. She has young children she's raising. She doesn't want to be known as the person who helped convict her father, but she also presumably doesn't want to go to prison for perjury to protect him, and there's no good option here. Every path forward involves massive personal, professional, and family costs. Point number 4, the specific areas prosecutors are focusing on. In the fraud investigation, they want Ivanka to testify about specific loan applications and financial filings where the Trump Organization allegedly used inflated asset values. They want to know what Ivanka knew about the true values versus the reported values. They want to know who decided what numbers to use and why. They want to know whether there were internal discussions about whether the valuations were defensible or accurate. In the January 6th investigation, they want to know about meetings where election overturning schemes were discussed. They want to know what Trump was told about election fraud claims and by whom. They want to know about Ivanka's efforts to convince Trump to call off the rioters on January 6th. They want to know about communications with other Trump advisors and allies about post-election strategy. And prosecutors apparently have specific evidence related to all of these areas. They're not asking Ivanka to give general impressions or vague recollections. They have documents they're going to show her and ask her to explain. They have text messages she sent that they're going to read back to her. They have testimony from other witnesses that they're going to confront her with if her answers don't match. This is a highly prepared prosecution coming at her with a detailed roadmap of what they want to cover and evidence to back up every line of questioning. Point number 5, what happens if Ivanka does testify truthfully and what that could mean for the various cases. If she admits that the Trump Organization knowingly used inflated valuations for loans and insurance while using deflated valuations for taxes, That's powerful evidence of intentional fraud. Juries understand that kind of conduct. Judges have already ruled against Trump in the civil fraud case, but if there are criminal charges that follow, Ivanka's testimony could be the difference between conviction and acquittal. If she testifies about what Trump knew regarding election fraud claims, if she can say that multiple people told him the election wasn't stolen, but he kept claiming it was anyway, that goes directly to proving Trump's criminal intent in the January 6th case. That's the kind of testimony that's hard for a defense to overcome because it comes from a family member who was there and has no obvious motive to lie against her father. But there's also the question of what Ivanka's truthful testimony could mean for her own legal exposure. If she admits she knew about fraudulent valuations and signed off on documents containing those valuations, she's potentially admitting to her own participation in fraud. If she admits she was in meetings where illegal schemes were discussed and didn't report them, she's potentially admitting to conspiracy. Her lawyers are going to try to thread a very fine needle where she gives prosecutors enough to satisfy the subpoena but doesn't incriminate herself. But that's extremely difficult when prosecutors have detailed evidence and can ask very specific questions. The possibility of immunity is something that might come up. Prosecutors sometimes offer witnesses immunity in exchange for a truthful testimony, meaning the witness can't be prosecuted based on their own admissions. But immunity agreements are complicated, and there's no indication that prosecutors have offered Ivanka immunity or that she'd accept it if offered. Accepting immunity would mean she's admitting she did things that could be prosecuted, which would destroy her reputation, even if she avoided criminal charges, and it would definitely be seen as betraying her father, which would have enormous personal and family consequences. The broader impact on the Trump family legal strategy is also significant. For years, the approach has been unified defense. Everyone denies everything. Everyone attacks the prosecutors as politically motivated. Everyone stands with Trump no matter what. But if Ivanka breaks ranks and gives testimony that hurts Trump's defense, that unified front collapses. It becomes harder for Don Jr. or Eric to maintain certain claims if their sister has already contradicted those claims under oath. It makes Trump himself more vulnerable if his own daughter is providing evidence against him. And there's the media and public opinion aspect. Ivanka has been the most polished and publicly acceptable member of the Trump family. She's the one who's been on magazine covers and has her own business brand. If she testifies against Trump, that's going to get massive media coverage. It's going to be portrayed as Trump losing even his own daughter's support or loyalty. That could affect public opinion in ways that might influence potential jurors or might influence political support for Trump. Alternatively, if Ivanka refuses to cooperate or clearly lies to protect Trump, that could generate sympathy for Trump among his base, who see it as the family standing together against political persecution. So the stakes here are enormous on multiple levels. Legal stakes for both Trump and potentially for Ivanka herself. Political stakes for Trump's image and support. Family stakes in terms of relationships and loyalty. Financial stakes given the massive judgments and potential additional penalties in the fraud case. And historical stakes in terms of how this whole saga of investigations and legal battles ultimately resolves and how it's remembered. What we're watching is prosecutors tightening the noose and going after one of the people closest to Trump, someone who has unique knowledge and whose testimony could make or break multiple cases. Ivanka can't avoid this anymore. She's been subpoenaed. Prosecutors say they have evidence she can't deny, and soon she's going to have to make some very difficult choices about what to say under oath and what consequences she's willing to accept for whatever choices she makes.